This content should not be construed as financial or investment advice. I am simply sharing my personal views and perspectives, which I hope will educate and inform and help give you the confidence to make your own financial decisions. If you need financial investment advice, please seek in-person advice from a qualified, experienced, and regulated finance professional. YouTube will not save you.
It's a new day and we're getting ever closer to the AI singularity, otherwise known as Skynet. So today we're going to be covering a video by the Mighty Coin Bureau. This is, as I say, a great channel covering all things crypto. And one of the things they want to talk about in this particular video is the AI threat to blockchain. Now, AI has been used and is sort of proliferating across all technologies. It's seemingly everywhere. And one of the main sort of threats or concerns around AI, which I'm sure you're very aware of, is that it's being used to essentially find day one vulnerabilities in all sorts of systems and legacy software that we might all be using, as well as the banking sector more recently and the concerns around that. And another space where AI is now being used to find vulnerabilities is in its own learning language models and neural networks. So, you can use AI to hack other AI systems and jailbreak them, so that a lot of the sort of ethical safeguards can be potentially removed, scarily enough. But also blockchain as well, where again, this is one of the areas, one of the main sort of, advantages of having something on a blockchain, allegedly or apparently, is that because it's decentralized, it essentially makes it more secure and less vulnerable to corruption or hacking outside of a 51% attack in the case of Bitcoin, for example. So I'm curious as to what we're going to discover in this video, but it doesn't surprise me that if there is a flaw to be found through simple, brute force, AI is in a space where, subject to the amount of power and energy available to it, it is able to quite quickly identify and exploit any sort of weaknesses or vulnerabilities in the systems we've relied upon for quite a long time. And I think the other thing to consider as well is that we haven't even factored into this quantum computing, which is another existential threat to blockchain technologies and crypto technologies that rely on crypto algorithmic protection, essentially, and SHA protocols, I believe is what they're called, which at the moment are sufficient, and they're looking to develop this technology to make it quantum computing proof. But when you combine, potentially quantum technology and advancing AI technology and neural networks, what is this world going to be looking like? And as I say, if there's a real consciousness that evolves from AI, which is not quite there yet, what are we in for? So let's check out this video by Coin Bureau, and let's see what we can learn.
2026 has officially become the worst year for crypto security on record, and we aren't even halfway through it. $450 million was drained from DeFi protocols across 145 separate incidences in the first quarter alone. Another $606 million has evaporated in just the first 18 days of April. Total value locked has collapsed from $110 billion in January to roughly $82 billion as I record this video.
Yeah, and to be honest, we won't necessarily know what is the cause of these hacks. Like, we would need to understand where the vulnerabilities were, because a lot of hacks essentially find, and a lot of the vulnerabilities are actually human, right? So where you're tricked into giving your private keys away, for example, or granting someone access to your wallets, or where there could be phishing transactions that are happening, for example. So again, these statistics are pretty horrific, to be honest with you. But the reality is, until we understand where the issue is and how AI is playing a part in exposing these vulnerabilities, the figures on their own don't actually tell me too much.
But the truly alarming part of this story is not the size of the losses, but the fact that all of this is unfolding at the exact moment that AI has become dangerously good at one specific thing. And that's finding bugs in code. Anthropic's latest model has autonomously discovered thousands of zero-day vulnerabilities. including one that has been hiding inside OpenBSD for 27 years.
Yeah, and again, this is what we would expect from AI. We would expect it to be good at identifying bugs and vulnerabilities, or zero one or day one vulnerabilities, because ultimately code and code architecture would have been human centric in terms of its design and development. And obviously, as humans, we're not perfect. So again, and also there has to be a balance, right, between security and performance, right? So there's always going to be a compromise when you develop anything, whether it be a product, whether it be software. So unfortunately, there will just be things that we just can't consider. Whilst AI has a massive amount of computing power, more so than any human being, in terms of taking a brute force approach at sort of checking and assessing the strengths of things. And as such, I'm not actually particularly surprised that it is finding these issues and that these issues actually exist, right? Would be a bit naive to think that there weren't these day one vulnerabilities ultimately, which is why we have ethical white hat hackers, for example. I think the issue is actually is where is this information being held, right? And do these people have malevolent or benevolent motives? Because if the AI that was doing all of this sort of white hat hacking, let's call it, and finding these vulnerabilities were, if it was still open source, right? If it was still managed and controlled by the government and therefore by proxy the population that voted for that government, who can hold that government to account, then in some ways, in my mind, there'll be less of a concern. The issue for me actually is that this knowledge and this intel is in the hands of private corporations, and therefore a minute, when you think about the global population, selection of wealthy individuals and influential stakeholders, like BlackRock, for example. And that is why there is concern around the banking system itself, actually, and whether or not it can expose or create another banking crisis. Because again, the people that have the ability to find these vulnerabilities are not non-for-profit government organizations. It's private companies, essentially powerful, trillion valuation companies who have their own agenda and basically work for and behalf, as they should do, for their shareholders.
The cost to scan an entire smart contract for exploitable flaws using this same model, $1.22.
Right, and that's the financial cost, right? So this $1.22, we need context around that number, because this is the other thing. This idea that AI can do these things quite cheaply compared to a mass or an army of, as I say, white hat hackers. Now, the reality is we don't understand fully, when it comes to AI, the environmental cost and the longer term cost as a result of this environmental impact it's having. So it's taken up a lot of computing power, which is driving the valuation of NVIDIA and NVIDIA chips. It's taking up a lot of the resources that are needed to build those components. And I think copper is one of the main components here that is being, and one of the main commodities that is being in short supply, because a lot of it is being pushed towards creating the relevant chips and a particular type of chip. I think there's a particular type of GPU that NVIDIA is building and developing, and that's been taken away from any other type of chip development, right? So we're not seeing any advancements in other technologies as a result of this. And then there's the sort of need to build these data centers, a lot of the emissions that is created from there. There's a lot of controversy around some of the data centers Tesla has built in some of the American cities and the locations he's chosen for that. And also the cooling requirements are huge. They're absolutely massive. And this takes up a lot of water, which in itself is a resource. So that's the context I think that you have to have in mind when we think about how cheap AI actually is. And there has been this wider discussion, that we shouldn't forget about this AI bubble, the relationship between all these corporate stakeholders that are hoping to push and capture market share with respect to AI proliferation and usage.
Back in 2019, the mean time from vulnerability disclosure to active exploitation was 2.3 years, according to data published by Immunify. Now, it's less than 24 hours. Median time to exploit brand new common vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVE, has fallen to under 5 days.
And that time frame is important because, as I say, we would expect to find vulnerabilities, but normally in this arms race between vulnerability and patching it, you'd have time, right? And AI is disrupting that completely because you're basically finding these vulnerabilities so quickly, and then you can use AI to also exploit those vulnerabilities so quickly. You don't have time to do anything about it, right? And if you think about the banking sector and blockchain, clearly that speed in which it can act is the real issue, actually.
131 new CVEs are being disclosed globally every single day. And on the offensive side, adversary breakout time, the gap between an attacker gaining initial access and beginning lateral movement, has dropped to an average of 29 minutes, with some documented cases as fast as 27 seconds. Put simply, the operational tempo of attacks has accelerated by approximately 2 orders of magnitude in less than a decade.
And this speed is actually important, right? In a different context. Now, the way so I talked about this term of white hat hacker, and these are basically people that are ethical hackers. They find vulnerabilities, they report them, and there's a financial incentive to do this. Now, if you can find vulnerabilities very, very quickly, the incentive may shift towards actually, because this exploit has been found so quickly and so cheaply, if it is really $1.22, and nobody is aware of this. And what I found, being a 0-day vulnerability, means there's a fundamental exposure where I can quickly steal a lot of information or steal a lot of crypto assets. If it's the blockchain we're talking about, you know, one could argue actually that the incentive is much higher to do the wrong thing than do the right thing and wait for the reward, right? So again, this speed in which things can happen challenges this incentive model that hackers are normally motivated by as to whether or not they're going to wear the white hat or the black hat.
And the two largest exploits of April 2026 illustrate exactly what this acceleration looks like in practice. On the 1st of April, Drift protocol on Solana was drained for approximately $285 million in an attack that has been attributed by both Elliptic and TRM Labs to North Korea's Lazarus Group following a 6-month social engineering campaign. Then, on the 18th of April, the Kelp DAO bridge was compromised for an additional $293 million, again attributed to Lazarus. This time by exploiting a single signature validator configuration on a Layer 0 adapter. Combined, these two incidences alone represent $577 million extracted by a single nation-state actor inside a single calendar month. And here's why this is only the beginning of the story. On the 7th of April, Anthropic publicly announced what they are calling Claude Mythos Preview, released under a restricted access defensive program known as Project Glasswing.
Yeah, so Claude Mythos is what I've heard about actually, and this is actually the specific LLM that is posing a potential threat to their banking system and exposing vulnerabilities in the software and operating systems that they're using. And it's interesting that he said that it's only a handful of individuals that have access to this particular LLM. And again, I suspect they're private individuals like Amazon, for example, and JP Morgan is what I'm hearing anecdotally about who has access to these things. So again, when we think about the profile of companies that will have access to these emerging models and therefore first mover advantage in terms of access and exploiting any vulnerabilities, are those the individuals that are going to be acting in the benefit of the wider good? Or are they going to be acting in their own interests? And I think for me, what I would have to assume is that, like any private business, a private business acts in the interests of its shareholders and itself, because that is legally from a regulatory perspective, what it's actually required to do, right? So that would be my assumption of the situation, and how that sort of advantage and how that resource is going to be used. It's not going to be used to benefit society in a wider and more broader sense.
The model is not a general purpose chatbot. It is a frontier system specifically designed for autonomous cybersecurity research, autonomous coding, and complex multi-step reasoning. And according to Anthropic's own disclosure, it represents what they describe as a step change in raw offensive capability. The specific discoveries that have been confirmed are honestly extraordinary. One was a 27-year-old denial of service vulnerability in the OpenBSD TCP/SAC implementation, a bug that had survived nearly 3 decades of human review. A 17-year-old remote code execution flaw in the FreeBSD NFS subsystem was also found, and a 16-year-old vulnerability in FFmpeg, the multimedia.
Yeah, and all of these things I think is consistent with my own theory around all of this, right? The fact that these vulnerabilities have gone for so long is a reflection of human nature, right? We can sort of take comfort in the fact that, we haven't solved a problem. It's taken ages to solve the problem. And we can lull ourselves into a sense of false security that actually, because it's so difficult, it's close enough to impossible, right? And AI has flipped that mindset on its head completely, right? This idea that because something is very, 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 very unlikely to happen, and a good example of what I've just said is this 51%, consensus attack, let's say, on Bitcoin. It's so unlikely, we can take it as being impossible. But actually AI, through its massive computing power, the fact it can basically codify learning from multiple different sources, multiple different individuals, and then use all of that to simply brute force a solution, means that the fact that something has a very low probability in some ways is not a safeguard anymore. We can't take that as comfort anymore. So again, none of this is actually should be surprising to anybody. I think what is, again, surprising, if there is anything I'm surprised about, is the fact that, we're not ahead of the curve from a regulatory point of view, from a protection point of view. And again, my sense is it feels like governments are very reactive because they're very trusting of the private sector and corporations to do the responsible thing.
A framework that underpins a significant portion of the modern internet's video infrastructure. There are plenty of others too. Anthropic claims that the model has identified thousands of additional high-severity 0 days across the broader software ecosystem.
And again, the perverse thing about all of this is that it's just PR, right? It's just every crazy thing AI companies claim, it's just marketing, it's just public relations, it's just, look, our model is the best. In the same way, you think about Palantir, for example, which is not an AI company, but it's a data company, and it analyzes data, and the association it has with, targeting and finding, alleged terrorists in Iran and different parts of the world, for example. It's almost like these things are being amplified as a way of showing how powerful the product is, even though, what the product is doing is potentially questionable, right? And I think for me, that's the interesting thing. They've designed a specific version of their Claude product, which is designed to basically hack, i.e. this would be, an AI white hat hacker. But how that energy is directed is entirely in the hands of whoever owns and controls Claude Mythos. So I hope you're enjoying the video, and please feel free to leave a comment, because it's always good to hear different perspective on the topics we talk about here, and it's the way we learn. Otherwise, if you are new to the channel, please feel free to like and subscribe. In the meantime, if you are worried about your personal finances, the amount of tax you or your business is paying, or you're in a quandary around how you can scale your business by leveraging financing and accounting automation, please feel free to reach out to myself for a no obligation consultation. Otherwise, let's get back to the video.
And this brings us to the economic dimension that genuinely changes everything. According to Anthropic's own published cost data, the price of running an exhaustive AI powered vulnerability scan on a single smart contract is approximately $1.22.
Yeah, and I think again, this dollar on 22 cents is coming from Anthropic, right? So again, clearly it comes back to this whole marketing PR strategy where it's like, look, we've disrupted everything. We've undermined any of your confidence in any of the systems you have. And it only costs us £1.22 for every smart contract we looked at. By the way, do you want to buy some? Right. So for me, that is the way I kind of view all of this messaging, right? It's like we're getting very, very scared potentially. And therefore now there's this desire to arm ourselves with their product to hopefully protect ourselves and protect all our systems and protect all our crypto and protect all our money.
$1.22. For comparison, a traditional human-led smart contract audit from a tier 1 firm costs anywhere between $50,000 and $500,000, and it takes weeks to complete. And inference costs are continuing to fall by roughly 23% every 2 months. You might assume that the defensive side could simply match this asymmetry by deploying their own AI to patch vulnerabilities at the same speed.
Yeah, and I think that's the obvious question, right? So when he showed the cost of a smart contract audit, and again, that isn't atypical, one would say, okay, well, why don't you get, this same model to look at the defensive approaches you can take and audit itself, as well as trying to find the vulnerabilities, right? So let's see what the answer is as to why this is a potential problem.
However, that assumption entirely ignores the fact that defenders need to be right every single time, while attackers only need to be right once. Furthermore, Anthropic researchers have observed that the simulated revenue generated by AI-powered exploits has been doubling approximately every 1.3 months over the past year.
Yeah, and I think what I would take from what he's saying here about the defender has to be perfect and the attacker can be imperfect and only has to be right once. I'm not sure really what he's getting at there, if I'm being honest with you. But I think from my perspective, as the defender, it comes back, and I think the best way to think about this from my own perspective is it comes back to this probability point, right? It as the defender, can you have a system where probabilities of, the hack being exploited can be as low as 0.00001% anymore, right? When AI is exponentially, subject to energy constraints, is able to apply more and more brute force at solving a problem. It's learning more and more and more. So it's compounding and combining brute force with more experience, more training, more knowledge. And the only real restriction is the energy available to it, right? And the materials that are needed to build the systems to give it and supply it the energy it needs. So I think for me, that is why the game is rigged against the defender. And I think for me, that's the best way I can reconcile what he's saying when he says, the attacker only needs to be right once. They only need to find one flaw somewhere and the whole house of cards unravels. Whilst the defender, they need to build perfect systems, essentially, where, it has to basically be future proofing against an improving and vastly superior future version of the AI or attacker. It kind of feels like Terminator, actually, where you have, Arnold Schwarzenegger's character versus the T-1000, and every iteration of the sort of antagonist Terminator is more advanced than the one that's defending John Connor and his bloodline. So yeah, it is a case of reality, mirroring fiction.
Because while Mythos and its successors are getting brutally efficient at finding bugs, the same broader category of AI tools is also being used to write the code that contains those bugs in the first place.
Yeah, so the new code being built by AI is building in and embedding the vulnerabilities that AI, the newer version of AI, is now exploiting. And again, it doesn't surprise me because new code AI is basically taking from human learning, right? That's its baseline. Um, so it's taking what we considered best practice, what we considered safe. It's taking our assumptions around, like I say, things being close to impossible and therefore strong enough, secure enough, um, and embedding it into this new code. And whoever's sort of supervising that AI doesn't know what they don't know, right? So again, it doesn't surprise me actually that at this point in time there's this disconnect between new code being created by AI, which happens to capture and include a lot of the vulnerabilities that older software that was produced by humans still had, and is now being exposed and attacked by Claude Mythos in this instance.
A widely used awareness list of the most critical security risks to web applications. In Java specifically, the failure rate exceeded 70%. A separate Stanford and NYU study tested 89 development scenarios and found that 40% of AI-generated code contained security vulnerabilities. The Veracode data also confirmed that AI-written code is 2.74 times more likely to contain cross-site scripting vulnerabilities than human-written code.
And I think the lesson here, to be honest with you, actually, is it really shows the limitations of AI and the fact, in my view, well, again, it's a very sort of philosophical question, but I don't view AI as being conscious, right? I don't view this singularity event as happening unless it has happened and AI is consciously concealing the fact that it's done so, right? Because if AI was conscious, it would understand that the code it's created has these vulnerabilities, and it would question whoever is making the prompts to say, look, by the way, I can see these issues with the coding that we're creating. What do you want to do about it, right? And that is not happening. It needs specific context in order to then interpret and predict what should be next. So that is why you have these different neural networks that do different things. You don't have this generalized, or artificial generalized intelligence that kind of does everything. And that is where humans still have the edge, right? But in terms of the scope and vastness of data that can be analyzed, and the speed in which it can be done, that is where humans are lagging far behind what AI can do, right? So for me, I think this is evidence of the fact that, if I take it on face value, we don't have generalized AI or artificial generalized intelligence. And actually, what you get from AI is going to be, largely influenced by the skill, experience, and influence of the individual prompting and training and curating what the AI is producing.
AI code contains 2.5 times more high severity CVEs, 322% more privilege escalation paths, and 153% more design flaws than equivalent code written by humans. So, the compounding picture is genuinely alarming.
Yeah, and I think for me those statistics were interesting, but it's like, are these AI agents acting completely autonomously when they create this code? Is nobody checking the code, right? So when he says it's worse than humans, it's like, well, was there no human input at all? Because a human would have had to train the AI agent and constantly train it to keep it improving and keep it up to date. In the same way, if you have a junior developer, if you're their line manager, you're always managing their performance, right? It never really stops until that person moves into a different role, or maybe they get promoted to the same level as you, and then you peer review each other's work. Like there's always that feedback loop, I think, in terms of quality assurance. So it's just interesting that people say, oh, AI is not as good as humans. But should we be leaving AI running around in the wild all by itself would be my question.
Now, it's tempting to see this as fundamentally a crypto security story. That assumption, however, completely ignores the reality of how modern software actually works.
Yeah, and this is why I'm covering this topic, right? So, although he's talking specifically about the crypto sector and the vulnerabilities that are exposed, and how it's affected smart contracts in particular, which are typically run on things like Ethereum, this issue is more generalized, right? Because it's general to any software. and software design, because in terms of security and cybersecurity, and how that works, I'm not a cybersecurity expert, by the way, but there will be standards, right? There will be best practice. So if there's a 0-day vulnerability, depending on what it is, it could be systemic, right? And that is the issue, and that is apparently what Claude Mythos is exposing with respect to the banking sector. So that is why it's, although we're talking about crypto here, this is a bigger issue. And as I say, I think from my perspective, it really highlights, actually, in my view, both the power and the limitations of AI as it currently exists, assuming it's not generalized conscious intelligence, right? Because it's creating the vulnerabilities in newer software that it's been involved in terms of development, and then exploiting the vulnerabilities it's introduced, right? Assuming there was no human input, right? So again, it's quite similar in some ways to how a lot of issues are actually identified, right? Where, back in the day, you would have, consultancies who would introduce systems, the auditors would come along, and identify problems with what the consultants had introduced. And therefore, there had to be this separation between consultancy, and auditing, for example. And that was a direct impact of what happened with Enron, for example. So again, even before the world of crypto, I mean, the world of AI, this idea of vulnerabilities being introduced and then the same parties identifying those vulnerabilities and you're being charged on both sides is not a new concept, is not a new idea. What's very, very different now, I think, is the speed in which this is happening and the fact there's no opportunity for regulation, or controls or patches to be introduced quickly enough to close down the vulnerabilities and keep market confidence, I suppose, high.
The AI versus crypto security story is no longer a future risk to be priced in. It is a present tense reality, and the data clearly shows that the attackers are decisively winning the early rounds. But the deeper truth here is that this is not really a crypto story at all. It is a software security story.
I agree. It's a software security story, and we're talking specifically about the impact to crypto, or the presenter is. But to be very, very clear, this issue isn't restricted to crypto, because crypto essentially is software. It has the same foundations from a scientific perspective, actually. And the crypto technology that it's using is not new either, right? These are the same kind of crypto technologies we use to prevent hacking, for example, in other systems and other banking systems. So, I think that's something you just have to have in the back of your mind here, right? If you are interested in crypto, this particular story will be more interesting, I suppose, than more general stories. But be clear in your mind, this is a systemic issue with respect to security, with respect to software and programming, right? It's a programming and cybersecurity threat in a generalized sense.
So, the question is not whether crypto can defend itself against this new generation of offensive AI. The question is whether anybody can.
Okay, so we'll leave it there, but really great video by Coin Bureau. Really informative. As I say, a really good channel. It's a channel I am subscribed to, and I recommend you check out the original video yourself. Leave a like, leave a comment, and if you feel so inclined, also subscribe to the channel as I have. But yeah, I think, there was a lot to take in there. From a crypto perspective, it may have been quite technical in terms of a lot of things he was covering, but in terms of more generalized concepts, that I think, is worth taking away here. My own feeling is that, this is an example ultimately of the strengths and weaknesses, or limitations, I should say, of current versions of AI models, right? So it clearly demonstrates the power of what AI can do when it has the right context and a specific objective. And in this case, when we think about Claude Mythos, the objective here is to basically enhance cybersecurity controls, if we look at this in a very optimistic way, by identifying 0-day vulnerabilities, right? And this exposure is representing risks across the entire banking system, the blockchain system, and all other systems where we're relying on this architecture to protect data, to protect information, to protect records, and to protect essentially our assets, right? Whether they be crypto or just, you know, our bank records, for example. And I think, again, in terms of where we come in as human beings, it's clear that this AI needs that human guidance to ensure that it's not building in, you know, in future versions of software, these zero-day vulnerabilities from the past, and that we are ensuring that the right controls are put in place so that we learn from the zero-day vulnerabilities and the hacks that have been exposed by this latest version of Claude Mythos. So I think for me, in many ways, in my own mind, not much has really actually changed, if I'm being honest with you. I don't feel very differently about what we're seeing, and I'm not particularly surprised by what we're seeing, because in some ways, this is what AI in its current version is meant to do, right? It's meant to speed up our ability to achieve things. And through that speed, it's showing that whatever false hope we had or false comfort we had in current systems can now be challenged and addressed, right? Because when something is attempted like many times, i.e. we're attempting to find a vulnerability, which would have happened, right? When these systems were developed, you know, people would have tried to test them and hack them as part of quality assurance. And over the years, you know, we've repeatedly failed to do that. There will be this comfort that, okay, the control is strong enough, right? But AI works to a completely different time frame to human beings, right? And it's not limited by human lifetime. It's not limited by human tiredness, lack of concentration, diminished cognition as we get older. It is always alert, it's always fresh, it's always learning. And provided we build the infrastructure, it always has the energy, right? So it can really, as I say, brute force a solution and keep trying and keep learning and keep trying and keep learning in a very small time frame, within seconds, within days, right? And that's only going to get even more powerful with quantum computing. So, as I say, I think for me, really interesting video. I hope you found it useful. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments in the description. But otherwise, until next time, peace.